Okay. It's Belinda Honey here. I'll be hosting our session today. We're just going to wait a few minutes for participants to dial in and then we'll get started. We'll just wait another minute. A few people still dialing in. Okay, let's get started. Okay, my name's Belinda Honey. I'm an Executive Director and the Chair of Mapian, based in Perth, currently in isolation at home. So hopefully you won't hear a dog barking in the background. Unfortunately, my daughter brought COVID into the house, so we're all stuck at home, but that's okay. That's life these days. Thank you for all attending this webinar today. Great topic, something that we're all really passionate about, myself and all the people who are attending the webinar today. Gives us a great opportunity to share some of our experiences because many of us have been working in this space for a really long time in respect to the culture at workspace. So to give you some understanding of some of the things that we do, but also some of the examples that we see. And we've got a really experienced team of professionals from within Mapian today that I'll introduce you to shortly. So in the webinar today, it's obviously a Zoom webinar. As we go through the webinar, if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box at the bottom. We will monitor those questions as we go through. And I hope that people do have a lot of questions because we want to try and make this a forum where it's all like a conversation, where I have conversations with the panelists, you have the opportunity to ask questions, and I can ask those questions of the panelists for you. So please feel free to ask any questions. We will be keeping an eye on them. About halfway through the webinar, we'll stop to answer some of those questions. And then if there's any at the end, we'll also have a look at them. If we can't get through all of the questions today, then we will make sure that we answer them after the webinar, either by one of the panelists sending you an email with a response, or potentially we'll be looking at having a Q&A document as well. So the focus, like I said, is very much on the conversation. We're not doing presentations today. We really want to bring you some of our experiences. Like I said, many of us have worked in this field, some of us longer than others, but 30, 35 years of experience in this field, some of us, and a lot of experience in terms of conflict, mediation, cultural review, or assessments. Dr. Ian Haslam, I'll introduce you to in a moment, who heads up our assessment area. So over recent years, workplace culture has been at the centre for many employers across Australia. It's not a new thing though. For those of us who've worked in this space for a long time, we've been looking at all of the research and all of the considerations into workplace culture for many, many years. But often workplace culture traditionally has been really driven by human resources, by mid-level and senior management, organisational development. But now we've actually started to see a bit of a flip, a bit of a change. The focus is now becoming on boards, government, senior executives are now themselves starting to get quite interested in the organisational culture within an organisation. Not just from the perspective that culture can impact negatively on productivity, efficiency, the employee wellbeing and employee engagement within the organisation, but also that it can impact really positively as well in terms of the achievement of strategic plans and some of the organisation's imperatives. But there's also been a real focus recently on culture and risk, and that's why we're seeing boards, government and senior executives having a lot more focus on this. And I know I personally have been asked to speak to a number of boards on this particular issue because they can see that it's a risk issue and that is a cause for concern. The risk of legal action from employees, from shareholders, from wider stakeholders, the risk to reputation, the risk to attraction and retention of employees, the loss of talent, the risk to achievement of corporate strategy, and many other areas. So there's a much wider understanding of the impact of organisational culture. Everyone's been talking about the Rio Tinto report, and all credit to the Rio Tinto board. That decision to actually release that paper has provided many people with the opportunity to read it and consider what that actually means in respect to their own organisation and whether they can learn anything from what's happened with Rio Tinto. So that's obviously been the biggest and most high-profile example of what we've seen recently, but they're definitely not alone. And just in the last few months, we've seen examples from banks, insurance companies, casinos, all levels of government, mines, universities, and we could probably name a lot of other industries as well. So what makes a toxic culture and what makes a positive culture? And how can you identify what is actually happening within your own organisation? These are some of the questions we will be discussing today. So let's move on to the panellists. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ian Haslam. Ian has extensive experience in leadership assessment and development across organisations and has worked with employees just starting their careers through to experienced executive leaders in both the private and public sector. As an organisational psychologist, Ian brings particular expertise in the development, administration and consultation for psychometric assessments, including for workplace cultural understanding. He leads the Mappian psychometric function to provide value to our clients across sector and industry. So thanks, Ian. We also have with us today Katie Russell, who's one of the longest serving Mappian employees, who's been with the business for many, many years. She's our in-house expert on conflict resolution. Resolving conflicts is the main focus of what she does within our business. She uses a strategic approach to diagnose the root causes of conflict and develops inventive yet practical advice to manage difficult situations. She also has an extensive background in industrial relations, and this gives her an excellent insight into the patterns of conflict in the workplace. She became increasingly aware that many individuals and organisations do not handle conflict effectively. She has seen many situations escalate and become very damaging when they could have been resolved using a different approach. So she brings a very specific understanding of workplace culture and the impacts of it. We also have with us Mark Brady, another very experienced practitioner. Mark's recognised within our business and with our clients for providing very creative and practical solutions for complex workplace issues. He's an experienced investigator and is often called on to conduct some of our most challenging investigations within the Queensland business. He brings to his work a genuine desire to reach resolution in a constructive manner where possible. He doesn't shy away from the hard issues. He conducts cultural reviews. So Mark conducts a lot of the cultural reviews within our business, particularly within Queensland. So he's got a very deep understanding of workplace culture. And lastly, we've got Darren Montgomery. Darren's been a more recent addition to our team, but brings a really interesting skill mix into our business because he's an experienced lawyer from the UK, but he's also a former senior detective. He has significant expertise in complex investigations and dispute management. He's also an accredited mediator and directly understands the link between workplace culture and risk, and he'll be talking about that. So before we open, employees often complain about things in a workplace. We all deal with that every single day, and we're never going to get rid of that. That's always going to be there. But a toxic workplace culture is something very, very different, with significant impacts on turnover, productivity, and efficiency. Some examples include unethical behaviour, bullying and harassment, backstabbing, disrespect. And as we've seen in the Rio Tinto report, a company can have significant resources and policies and procedures focused on these areas, but there's still a toxic culture. So let's dig a bit deeper, and I'll now move on to the panelists. All right, Ian, let's start with you with that very obvious question. Let's start with the obvious. What is workplace culture?
It's funny, it's the obvious question, but it's also the most difficult probably to answer out of the whole kind of series of questions we'll look through today, because it feels so kind of abstract and out in the ether. What is culture? And we've been talking for a few decades, that definition written in textbooks, it's, the easiest way to say it is it's the way we do things around here. And it's kind of a little bit of a safer way to look at it, because it doesn't really highlight the fact that it's quite behavioral, like you see evidence of it every day. So really, the way I describe it is that it's the behaviors that we're expected to display to fit in. So those kind of behavioral norms, like the normal way to be that we see and behave and execute our roles. How do you do that in a way that makes you look like you're fitting in with the rest of the business? Like, this is the normalized behavior that we see. And so you can see that every single organization, every department, public or private sector, it doesn't matter, there is a culture within your workplace. There is a standard way to behave to fit in. And the degree to which it is useful or toxic, that's what differs between organizations. So everyone has a culture, but its usefulness and its toxicity is the bit that differs. And so we see that coming out in those times of challenge, in those times of testing. What behaviors are we leaning on in order to explore this, to make it through this challenge? And that's what we tend to see. We can see those toxic behaviors are the ones that erode the usefulness of the organization. They have an impact on the people. That's against what the purpose is, what we're here to do. So the way that we act, and we're expected to act in order to fit in with the organization.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So why would you encourage companies then to get a deeper understanding of their workplace culture? Because it's often been something we talk about generally, but getting that more deeper understanding, why do you think that's important?
Well, I'd answer that with another question, which is why wouldn't you take a closer look at it? Because it's got such deep impact into, like a combination of behaviors all moving into a similar direction. It's very, very hard to stop. So often you can see signs that, where we're going in the wrong or right direction well before we have a chance to do anything about it. Some really good examples, just that are off the top of our heads, that are quite notable. You mentioned a few before, Belinda, but even just some of our bigger casinos across Australia losing billions of dollars in order to be able to continue operating, just based on that governance issue that they had. Something like Volkswagen Group's reputational damage a couple of years ago, just through the misrepresentation of their emissions from their vehicles. And another one that just came up a little bit recently for me would be Uber, which is an ultra successful, incredibly powerful technology company, where in the last couple of years, what they've done is had to really look at that culture internally. And even at certain points, I'm not sure if many people are aware of this, but at Uber's IPO, during that initial launch, they actually had to document previously found cultural issues and leadership issues from one of their previous CEOs, the founder of the company. And it ended up losing them what's estimated to be a few $1 billion in their initial launch, because they had to make mention of that and the work that they had to do. And these are just very public examples. I mean, another one, the leadership culture within something like Chernobyl, the power plant disaster in the mid-'80s, just that culture of authoritarianism and not speaking up, and having those voices silenced. And so that is the negative side of having that culture in quite obvious ways, which is disregarding the more private examples where there's not necessarily quite as big or spectacular an outcome, but still impacts on profitability and productivity and workplace satisfaction for the employees themselves not reaching that potential. Whereas we've seen some examples, which I won't list now, of some of those really positive and productive and useful and protective cultures as well. So getting a temperature gauge of what that looks like and what could be improved before anything drastic pops up is kind of one of the most easiest ways to see, why would I do this? Well, it's more of a risk mitigation strategy at that point. Okay,
all right. And, from our experience, and as we've seen as well in some of the recent examples, an initial helicopter view of workplace culture may show that everything's okay, but it's only when you start to deep dive that the issues come out.
That's exactly right. Having a look at really the core foundational behaviours, and it might not even necessarily be, do we have a bad or a good culture? We could have a really nice place to work, but is the behavioural norms associated with that really helping with the outcomes of the business itself or the function of the organisation itself? We can have a nice place to work, but productively speaking, we're not necessarily headed in the right direction. So it could even be, how can we improve, or what can we further leverage that we're doing well to make sure that we don't lose that essence of our culture, which is working so well.
Okay, thank you. Well, that sort of leads into our next question, and let's start on a positive, because when we talk about workplace culture, we can often talk about the negatives a lot. But Mark, Katie and Darren, you're out within workplaces all the time. What are some of the examples you've seen of positive workplace cultures, and what are the impacts of that positive culture? Mark, would you like to start with that question?
Sure, thanks, Belinda. I think a good sign of a positive workplace culture is where you've got a team, a group, or a unit that have got high workloads, high performance, and tight deadlines and that sort of thing, where they can work together to make things happen, but also have a way of, if there are roadblocks, how they work together to achieve their outcome when things on the way may get in their way. Because I think a team being able to address difficult issues as well as achieve what their outcomes are always a good sign of a workplace culture. Because you're not always going to have everything your own way. You'll get things thrown from left field. It's how, as a team, you can sit down, look at what's happening. How do we then overcome as a group? And it's that internal communication, the willingness to, give and take, and so that you can achieve what you need to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you make, Mark. It's not, we have to understand that the conflict and issues will arise within a workplace without a doubt, and that's never going to go away. So we're not talking about creating a culture where that's not there anymore. It will be there, but it's about how that team or the organisation deals with those issues. Yeah. That's great. What about you, Katie?
I think some of the signs I've seen that I know I'm in a place that's got a positive workplace culture is when I see particularly leaders and very senior leaders just demonstrating really positive day-to-day behaviours, and that's clearly the norm in that organisation. Because I do find it fascinating with organisations how people higher up the chain are often excused because it's okay for them to interrupt people. It's okay for them to not remember people's names. It's okay for them to kind of be rude, basically, in that sense. And because it's almost like, well, they don't have time to be nice. They're too important. And I think the organisations that I go to that I think have a great culture, you see people listening attentively to other people, not interrupting, using people's names. If it's a senior person, they use the name of someone who's much lower down the chain than them. And that's when you just feel it. Like, I know this is not a very scientific answer, but you feel it when you walk into the place and you see those behaviours are the behavioural norms in those workplaces. So in the same way you can have bad behavioural norms, you can obviously have great behavioural norms. And that's how I know straight away I've walked into somewhere that's got what I'd say is a really good culture.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And Darren, you've been in some really interesting workplaces and seen all types of cultures. What about you? What do you think? What are some of the examples
Yeah.
you see?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm obviously going into a lot of businesses at the point where there's a problem. So a lot of the cultures I see from the start are, you know, where the issues are. But perhaps a good example of a culture review that I was involved with about 18 months ago, which highlighted some of the problems were around some of the issues that Katie was just talking about, actually around transactional leadership styles. So, you know, they're authoritarian, not being interested in their workforce and their aspirations and development and stuff like that, and just being interested in themselves, really. And after the review, where some leaders were changed, some leaders were given training, going back and we did a periodic review with questionnaires 10 months later, and to see the difference was really amazing. And that difference was really brought about by what was clearly just a different style of leadership, so transformational leadership styles. Just those leaders taking a real active, attentive interest in their work, in their employees, and having a real interest in their aspirations and what they could do for them, and just giving them time. And that's what, and that was a lot what came out of the review, is that we just don't get listened to.
Right.
So,
yeah. No, that's a great example. I like that in terms of the way they turned it around as well, which is great.
Yeah, and it was good because we got the opportunity to go back and actually review, and was able to report and able to give some feedback. Say, yeah, look, I was here at the start, here now, and I can see some really positive changes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. All right, Katie. In your experience, what are some of the examples of toxic culture that you've seen, and what have been some of the impacts?
Well, I think really following on from what we've been speaking about already, I think I really noticed that I work a lot with teams and individuals, and particularly sometimes after an investigation or after a review, when we're trying to repair and help relationships get better than they are. But if I see a culture where one employee still, even in front of me as an external provider, is talking, is interrupting, is using a harsh tone, is being basically extremely dismissive of the other person, then the immediate assumption I make is, wow, if that person thinks that they're able to do this with impunity, basically in front of an external provider, that's clearly how they've been allowed to operate in the organisation. And then when you have those sort of more powerful, often there was someone who's higher status employee, when you see that those people have been basically allowed to behave badly, probably because they perform well in other KPIs, then, it does lead to that whole, what Darren was talking about before, authoritarian, people have a fear-based culture. No one makes a complaint because they know nothing will be done, because these sort of more powerful instigators are protected for other reasons. People leave, people go and get sick and end up on stress leave. So that's where I see it most. When I see these interactions in front of me, that I think, wow, that is not okay, that interaction. And what has happened that makes you think that that's okay? Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And so when you're thinking about culture within a workplace, what are the main areas that you consider?
Well, if I'm looking at the broader workplace issue, for me, I find it easier to sort of break it into a couple of categories, because I think it can be a bit overwhelming looking at all of the issues together. So what I like to do, obviously, the organisational culture, the behaviours that go across the culture, and it's kind of leads what Ian was talking about first up, about the norm. What are the norm behaviours in this organisation? So, is it gossipy? Is it highly sexualised? Is it positive? So that's the sort of behaviours across the organisation. And then if you've got the organisational culture, then you've also got the organisational environment. And I think sometimes we forget how much the environment can impact. So it could be something about jobs not being clear, job roles being ambiguous. It could be something physical. I know in Rio Tinto, the issue came up with the bathrooms and the lack of privacy and proper gender separation of bathrooms. So, it could be physical environment, or it could be more about the structure and the work. Then I would also think about individual relationships, because sometimes the whole place isn't broken, so to speak, but there's a handful of toxic individuals. I hate using that label, but individuals who are behaving in toxic ways, who are causing problems that are filtering out. So sometimes it's narrowing it down to trying to work with the individuals that are causing the problems. And then the last thing I would always look at is the systems and the processes that that organisation has in place. So do they have the policies in place? Do they have, what's their complaint policy like? Is it effective? Have they done the compliance training around workplace behaviours? So that's sort of the final category that I would always look at as well, because there's you can get a lot of data when you start asking these questions. So for me, it sort of helps to categorise them into those 4 categories.
Okay, thanks, Cody. All right, Darren, this has become, and I think we've seen more of the workplace culture reviews becoming more prominent over the last couple of years, and many of them as alternatives to investigations. So can you give us some examples of where a company has gone through a workplace culture review rather than an investigation? And do you think the two are linked?
So I think concentrating whether they're linked initially. Now, the workplace culture review uses a reactive tool to explore workplace concerns, and the workplace investigation, which by its nature is a reactive response usually to a specific event or incident or combination of events. Those frameworks, they're similar in that what both are looking to achieve is they've got a common desire to seek the truth about what the concerns are, what the allegations are. I think actually that's probably where the similarity probably ends, because beyond that investigation framework, when we look at that, it presents a very specific, normally a narrow scope of work about particular allegations, and the role of the point of the investigation is normally to determine on a balance of probabilities whether the allegations have been determined, whether they're substantiated or they're not substantiated, whereas the culture review framework provides a much broader opportunity for exploration of concerns and issues, and it isn't focused on making determinations simply on balanced probabilities. It's more about recommendations. So the big difference, and the thing to think about here, is what happens following unsubstantiated allegations which flow from a workplace investigation. Well, presumably a respondent party for that investigation will probably go back to work and, potentially with a clean bill of health, as in, unsubstantiated allegation, nothing to worry about, we can move on. But what really does an unsubstantiated allegation actually mean? So it's a determination, it's unsubstantiated. Well, what that means is the investigator on the balance of probabilities was 51% sure that the behaviour didn't occur, which therefore means that it's entirely possible there's a 49% chance that the behaviour did occur. So now hopefully that demonstrates the difference of these two approaches. Whilst loosely linked with looking at seeking the truth, recommendations from a culture review is a much, and we already talked about this, provides an opportunity for a much deeper dive. It provides a flexibility that the process above what a process for an investigation provides, which is much more narrowly scoped and a balance of probability finding. So they're linked, but there's some significant differences. I hope that kind of explains that. And in terms of the sorts of culture reviews that we're seeing, something I've discussed with a client a couple of weeks ago is they are introducing a new upstander policy. So to move away from, sending a message, you can no longer be a passive bystander and you have to be a proactive upstander and make disclosures. So they're putting obviously some responsibility on all their employees to make disclosures about behaviours that they're seeing. So what we've been discussing with them is, okay, alongside that, let's support and complement that at this stage with a culture review. Because rather than putting onus on employees right now, from this date, you're now responsible for upstanding. Okay, let's do a culture review at the same time, which gives them the platform and the opportunity to upstand and talk about what they've seen, which then also allows the organisation to deal with those behaviours that come to notice and start with a clean slate when they introduce this new upstander policy.
Okay, that's good advice. Okay, Mark, before we move on to there's a couple of questions there from the audience that we'll have a talk about, but obviously what's come out with the Rio Tinto report, and I myself have had a number of conversations with companies about this particular issue. Why do you think employees sometimes don't feel safe raising issues within a workplace, particularly some of the more serious issues around racism, bullying, harassment? How do you think we can encourage employees to raise these issues?
Okay, I think firstly, and this was very prominent in the Rio report, is whether it's real or perceived, complainants may well feel that there's going to be some sort of reprisal action. That means, excuse me, they won't get a promotion, or they'll be further isolated. Because sometimes people who may feel racism or, excuse me, or that sort of thing already feel marginalised, and they're going to feel that they're going to be further marginalised, or they feel that staff they may be putting complaining about may well be protected and nothing will happen. And, you know, they just put a target on their chest. And Darren also touched on some real impacts of investigations, is that, you know, the balance of probabilities, that sometimes people raise issues, you know, legitimately, and, you know, they may well have occurred, but there's not the supporting evidence to be able to prove it to the state, you know, to the level required. And they feel that then they're being called a liar, or, you know, and then they feel that they're going to be targeted as being one of those troublemakers or that sort of thing. So it's really about how do we make reporting or raising concerns in a safe way? How can we do that? And that means being able to support people who raise concerns, having a transparent path on how the concerns are managed, and knowing that if there is any reprisal action for making those complaints, that you know, that won't be tolerated. That doesn't also then fit into the culture of you know, not dealing with things or protecting certain people.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And so before we move on to those couple of questions for the audience, what's the work? We've referred a few times to workplace cultural review. What is it? What is a cultural review, and why do one, and what's the process?
Okay. Well, it's a thorough analysis of the issues affecting the functioning of the workplace, and what it wants to do is provide practical solutions for the employer, because solutions also have to be within the industrial arrangements and the business processes. So the way we see it being achieved, it's a multifaceted, staged approach, which means that all participants are provided with a supportive and safe process to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the workplace, and a way they can have a say into the way things can be improved. So I think firstly, one of the big differences between cultural reviews and investigations is cultural reviews can be done in a confidential way. What that means is that when reports come out, the sources of the information are not important. What the information is about, it's is the important thing. What people are trying to say, so that they feel they can open up. And depending on the dynamics of the workplace and the size of the workplace, you know, that can be achieved in other ways. You can use focus groups, one-on-one sessions, give people the opportunity to provide written submissions. And what we've found also is, in addition to the more sort of quantitative and qualitative processes, you know, where you have the one-on-one interviews, you get the information, online surveys that people who may not want to come forward still get an opportunity to participate in the process, and also having the qualitative data compared to then the survey, the quantitative data, it's a good control test to see that what your people are telling you is supported in broader surveys. So, and I think it's also important that when you undertake these reviews, you know, you ensure that you include the managers, you ensure you include senior staff, so that they participate in as well, so it doesn't become this is a time, you know, that can further divide. So that's the sort of the information gathering process. And then what it's about then is how you put it all together in a report that's easy to understand and also provides practical solutions for the employer. So you want to be able to make findings that are, that you can, you've got the data and information to support the findings, and then use that information then to identify where the issues are and what can be done to address the issues.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing a lot more in the last month or two. We've been contacted a lot about these, obviously, with the publicity of the Rio Tinto report, but just that ability to deep dive and get that real understanding. And we'll talk a little bit about that with Ian some more after some of the audience questions. But we do have a couple there, and I did want to have a look at them. One of the audience members has said, my experience is that while managers complain a lot in Australian culture, they're conflict averse when it comes to dealing with situations. And they've asked, would any of the panelists like to comment on that one?
A little observation on that one, just off the top of my head. It's one of those outcomes that you can look at as a behavioural outcome of a more toxic or a less useful culture. Is a lower level of psychological safety. So we talk about that in the sense that we feel safe and okay with being ourselves, speaking up and engaging, providing input and challenging others, and doing so without fear of issues or punishment or reprisal. And this extends not just to the employee body, but like Mark just mentioned, we include leaders, managers, the entire family from the organization, because that's where culture comes from. And that can be extended to leaders and managers as well, in the sense that they don't feel safe enough to have those difficult conversations. So the idea of addressing culture-driven behavior in that direct and appropriate way is also then impacted by the same culture by making it feel like less of a safe route with which to have the difficult conversation. So it's almost a wicked problem that you're describing there, in the sense that it's having outcomes for everybody at every level. And when we're still frustrated with not being able to move forward with having those conversations.
Yeah. And I know some of our team members have done some training for clients in this area to help leaders manage conflict and develop more confidence in dealing with some of these situations. So, because it doesn't come naturally for a lot of people. And I think, maybe it is the Australian culture that we don't want to approach conflict. Okay.
I've not met more than a handful of people who genuinely seem to enjoy having those difficult conversations with staff members. Yes. It's universally disliked.
Yes. So
I think there's this two aspects to that. What Ian spoke about is in there's a culture where that's not the norm, and there's not the safety to have the conversations. And then Belinda, you highlighted sometimes people don't have the skills. So I think you need both those. You need to cover both of those things, because I think sometimes I've certainly done training in organisation where you can help people with the skills to have those conversations and give frameworks and role play, whatever. You can build up people's skills. But if people still don't feel safe within the culture to have the conversation, well, it's a waste of time. So you need to make sure you've got both those things right, the balance right, before you before people will have those conversations.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. The next question was, in a transfer of business situation, how do you assimilate culture? Would any of the panelists like to have a go at that one? I've myself done quite a lot of work in mergers and acquisitions and transfer of business situations. And in my experience, one of the worst things you can try and do is just clash the two cultures together and expect them just to fit in. I think that trying to develop a bit of an understanding of the differences between the two cultures, and then getting that real, very clear leadership to lead the organisation as you bring the two together, and using leaders to reinforce positive behaviours, using leaders themselves to behave in certain ways, that will have the biggest impact. So having senior executives out talking to the business that's been acquired, and really reinforcing those positive behaviours. Any of the panelists want to make a comment on that?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I was just going to mention that I think it's really, that's where leadership really comes into an important position, that they're the ones that people will be looking toward. And I think it's so true. And I've seen it so many times on the ground where there has been mergers and the cultures have been basically just put together. And it's almost, leadership selected, well, company A got that one, company B got that one. And, so it's all about good, strong and clear leadership.
That leadership is really critical, because like you mentioned, Belinda, that you just whacking them together and trying to see if they'll stick and work for the original purpose, just it doesn't work, because they are sometimes in quite opposite conflict. And so the job is then down to leadership to take a really mindful approach to stepping right back and re-establishing right back to the drawing board. Okay, what is important? So understanding that culture is driven by a couple of things. It doesn't just appear. And so realizing now, as this more joint entity, what is our purpose? Why do we exist? And when nailing that question, okay, well, if that's why we exist, what is important to us? So really listing, really honestly, what those values are, those important things that should drive that purpose. And then out of that comes those expected normative behaviors. And so modeling, driving, communicating really strongly along those lines, but always stepping back and going back to that drawing board and re-establishing, why do we exist? What is important to us? How do we behave in that context? And then driving off interventions from there.
Yeah. No, thank you. All right, so let's get back onto the questions for the panelists. Ian, I've had this conversation with 4 different boards and executive groups in the last 2 months. But Belinda, our engagement survey results, or some other survey, are really good. We can't understand why these issues around bullying, harassment, racism, labour turnover, etc. are rising. What's your response to that?
Engagement surveys are, so take a step back, engagement surveys are incredibly useful and should be conducted at least annually, but ideally pulse through the year, because you want to get that sense of what it essentially is, which is a satisfaction survey. And then when structured correctly, it'll be along those lines that you want to see in terms of those engagement factors. Support and trust in leadership, training and development, reward and remuneration, safety, well-being, those kinds of things that will generally load up into an engagement score. But it's quite surface level, and it's directly observed, just the climate, the snapshot, and it exists within a broader sphere of culture. So satisfaction is that initial kind of off the top of my head satisfaction, but the cultural behaviors themselves they're significantly deeper. So chasing down a culture assessment and really looking to get to the heart of the behaviors themselves is quite confronting. And it can't always be leveraged out of just a survey. It's the idea that we're looking at here is that you can operate within a culture, and that world is normal for you. That culture, the behaviors, you exist in a world that's normal for you, and therefore your engagement is always dependent on that culture. So it could be quite strong relative to where the actual culture itself is. It could be quite toxic, and you're so used to that that if there's an improvement in things like your pay or the training opportunities that you're given, those other cultural issues remain, but your engagement score will be increased by these other things that kind of float in amongst within that context. So culture is significantly deeper, and you will often not see the forest through the trees with a culture like that, because it is so ingrained, particularly if it's been there for such a long time. But little things like engagement, they can fluctuate and shift, and it often comes out of the back of that culture in the first place. So just like what Darren said earlier, it is much deeper, and you can't really follow the traditional what is engagement, we'll just measure those factors. a culture review goes significantly more personalized and deeper because it touches on those specific symbols or that language or the deeper behaviors that you tend to avoid watching because it's so normal, it's habitual for you. But having a third party come in, watch, observe, see those behaviors, pull these out of people through interviews or through other methods, focus groups, whatever you decide to go through, you'll often find that there's a deeper, much more meaningful thread of behavior that goes much deeper than engagement, which will generally sit on the surface almost cosmetically. A lot of words there to say culture is deeper and it's unique specifically to you, and it needs that insight from the external side to be able to see inside to get that idea.
Yeah. One of the examples I've seen personally of this was in relation to a cultural review that we did in Western Australia, where and again their engagement survey results weren't too bad. You know, there was room for improvement, it wasn't too bad. But when the cultural survey review was actually done, there was some pockets of the business where there was some quite deep-seated racism, which was really concerning. And we were working with an Aboriginal consultant on this project at the time, and I actually said to her, why are these issues around racism not coming out? Why are employees not reporting them? Why are they not coming out in the engagement survey? And she said to me, because the Aboriginal employees have been living with these issues their whole life. So it's nothing new for them in a workplace, and they just accept that it's part of the workplace. Doesn't make it right, but they just move on and they don't want to challenge it. So, you know, which is pretty concerning from an organisation's perspective. So what are some of the assessment tools that can be used to identify culture?
And to go back to that initial observation, you know, the fact that it's very personal and specific, the very best way to assess is through customized assessment approaches specific to your organization, its purpose, its needs. And that speaks back to the consideration of the purpose and consideration of what those values levers really are. What is important across all of our business or all of our department, our organization, that stems out of that purpose. And so having somebody come in really to understand, you know, what are your purpose, your mission, your values currently? How will we measure that in your employees' behavior? Kind of going into the process with a looser idea, just a data gather, before then bringing together thematic concepts that are specific to that organization, so that we can then explore those a little bit further to really understand which behaviors sit under there and what those outcomes of behaviors are, positive or negative or neutral. So again, long story short, customizing an approach is really the best way to get the most valuable piece of reporting, of evidence, of pulling that information out. And you know, ideally, if you're coming at it from the external perspective, you do have that broader objective view. There are some standard culture surveys. There's a few out there that can be broadly generalizable. There's your OCIs, for example. You've got some tools from human synergistics that are quite useful, but they are quite general and they do kind of have to overlay over the top of your current context. So diving in a little bit deeper to understand how to categorize these behaviors, describe them, and take a risk assessment approach to them. This is the behaviors that have these kinds of outcomes. Here's the risk that we would associate with that in terms of predicting quite adverse organizational or people outcomes. So the customized approach is best, and this can just be a consultation with whoever you're bringing in to look further deeply under the hood.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Katie, let's get back to you. Often, and changing tack completely, often an outcome of an investigation process is mediation, either individual or team building, conflict resolution. Does mediation, team building and conflict resolution work when there is a toxic culture?
On their own, no. So as a result of these sort of reports, often you end up with multiple recommendations and there's really multiple interventions that are required. So if you just said, will just do mediation in isolation and didn't deal with the broader issues of the culture, then no, it wouldn't work, because you're sending people back out into a culture that is very, that has, toxic behaviours are happening. So, and even doing sort of team building activities, they don't work unless you address the broader cultural issues as well. So I don't want to say, it's not that those processes don't work per se. I don't want to put myself out of the job as a mediator. And if mediation is very much isolated to two people within a culture that's otherwise fine, then obviously that's a real reason to do it. But you might still do it as part of an outcome of a broader cultural review, but you would never just do that. And then it would be an issue of prioritizing, like what do you deal with first, and how you manage that. And that's something that a good report would make it clear about what the priorities are and what you should target first. But you don't, as I said, your first thing is not something like, well, let's all go bowling or let's have a fun day at the beach. That you need to, that might be something down the track that would be a useful thing to do. But let's deal with this culture first, and then we can move into those other processes.
Great, thanks, Katie. And one of the report recommendations in the Rio report, and we've spoken to a few clients about this, was that a more caring and human-centred response to disrespectful and harmful behaviours. This would be a discrete unit or contact area that focuses on supporting employees who want to discuss issues without reverting to a legal framework. What do you think of that approach?
Yeah, I think that was probably one of the most interesting things that came out of the Rio report, that sort of idea of about a very different way of dealing with the complaints when they come in-house. And I do think the way I sort of thought about it, it's almost like a formalised professional in-house version of what a contact officer network is. So, that people can come and see someone, talk about their concerns without necessarily, going to HR and making a formal complaint. And you can see why this is absolutely would be of value, because we've spoken about this already. Like, a lot of complainants, they've got serious concerns, they speak to HR, and suddenly they find themselves sort of funneled into a process like an investigation that doesn't necessarily serve anyone. And some of the reasons we've spoken about is, it's quite hard to substantiate those allegations, bullying allegations, the whole balance of probabilities, the whole natural justice, etc. So sometimes people really they raise something, but the processes don't serve them, and you can see why complainants just put up with it and don't bother. So I do think something fundamental needs to change with complaints processes. I do think for complainants to have that avenue, to have a supported, helpful kind of style of coaching or whatever it needs to be for them to deal with their complaints, fantastic. I do think there's a bit of devil in the detail, though, about how you would manage that in-house, because I do think there would be potentially some concerns that if a complainant tells someone in-house about something, then, duty of care immediately comes up. The in-house unit might feel compelled to take it out of the complainant's hands, depending on what came up. So I think you'd have to be careful how you've framed it all. I think there would definitely be the possibility of running that sort of service external to the organisation. So like an external contact officer support for someone who has concerns but doesn't really know what to do with them. So I like the concept, and I just think it would need more fleshing out to really make it work for everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Good advice. Darren, what's the link between workplace culture and risk? And what about workers' compensation risk?
Okay, so the link between culture and risk, firstly. So the risks present itself for employers in terms of those, and Katie just touched upon it, those duty of care obligations that employers owe to their employees to ensure that the environment they work in is safe. And how that links into workplace culture is that a toxic workplace culture can, and I'd go as far to say does, and if it doesn't, it will at some point create a hazard in the workplace. So that risk then is that the workplace hazard, the toxic culture, then manifests into behaviour, which can be categorised as bullying and harassing behaviours. And it's those behaviours that employers have a duty of care to protect their employees from being exposed to. So there's the risk. So, and the risk then manifests in psychological injury to employees, and also, there's as you mentioned at the start, Belinda, the reputational type of risk to businesses themselves. And workers' compensation, now obviously people going off sick with psychological injury, there's a risk that they're going to putting a claim for workers' compensation. And the risk there lies in terms of workers' compensation is the common law aspect of those sorts of claims. So outside of the non-fault work cover types of claims, when you have the common law risk and those claims, the exposure in terms of risk to the insurer and cost and expense is significant. So that duty of care is really important in terms of ensuring that those workplace hazards don't exist. Now, the part of the common law aspect is that the claimant, the employer, would have to prove that the organisation, the company, has been negligent in some way, that they've breached the duty of care, is exposed them to a risk, to a hazard, and that they've also been negligent. Now, they may suggest that the company's been negligent because they've been turning a blind eye to toxic workplace culture, or they've just ignored it, and et cetera, et cetera. So in these circumstances, what I would ask businesses to consider is about culture reviews. Now, it may be that you feel you don't even need a culture review because your culture is really great and it's not necessary. But think of this tool as, traditionally it's a HR generated reactive tool to some sorts of behaviours. But think of this as a risk assessment tool as well. So you're basically completing a risk assessment on your workplace, and if it comes back with a clean bill of health, that's great, because that product, that tool, by doing that process, you've presented yourself with a document that you can potentially rely upon if you ever do have a claim by somebody who suggests that your workplace is dangerous and you've been negligent. And I just ask businesses to consider it as a business culture risk assessment. Think of it like that as well, as opposed to the traditional kind of HR reactive generated process.
Okay, thanks, Darren. We're just going to wrap up with one final question for Mark, and then I'm going to ask the panelists a question because we've only got a few minutes left. We had a lot of questions, and it is great to see some of the conversations because it's obviously quite an involved area. But Mark, one of the things I did want to ask you is, what about the legal aspects of the workplace culture review? For example, how do you manage serious issues relating to bullying or racism that may be identified in a review?
Okay, thanks, Belinda. I think, and this is where the tension comes in, I think, between investigation and cultural reviews, because with a cultural review, to get the best information is a guarantee of confidentiality. And of course, if you're going to make serious complaints, there's the aspect of natural justice where you can't guarantee a complainant, or you can't guarantee it in good faith, that they'll be kept confidential, because anyone who they're complaining against has a right to answer any allegations. So there could be a process that, and I know it was talked about in the Rio report, of separating the two processes. In that, you have a cultural review team that does the cultural review, or a person, and they don't deal with formal complaints. But what they do is offer a pathway, whether it's to another consultant who's not involved in the cultural review, or via the formal complaints process, that people can then access complaints process, lodge complaints, but without it being then part of the cultural review, where you then may be put in a place by respondents' lawyers or tribunal to reveal all your notes and that sort of thing about where you came with the allegations. So perhaps the most practical way would be keeping the processes separate.
Okay, all right, thanks, Mark. Well, we're going to wrap up because we're just about to hit the hour, but I really want to finish up on a positive note because this is quite a complex area, and I think we all want to walk away with some, well, what can we do quickly to make a positive impact. So I'm going to give each of the panelists 30 seconds to answer the question. So in your opinion, what's the one thing that can make the most positive impact when trying to turn a culture around? Ian, we might start with you.
Big question.
One answer.
One answer. I'll try to behave myself and stick to it. The biggest bang for buck, and obviously it comes down to recommendations, what does need action, but the group in the area that can provide the biggest bang for buck in that sense is the source. Who's accountable for culture? It's our executive leaders. Who models said behavior? Where do the norms come from? Who creates the decisions? It's your executive leadership team. And therefore, looking at that culture, the cultural literacy, the literal actual language used by the group at that executive level, biggest bang for buck you could think of in terms of transforming culture in both slow and sustainable, but also quick win type ways as well.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Katie?
Probably very similar to what Ian said in a way, but that idea that the leadership group would have to start this specifically, deliberately creating some new behavioural norms that will replace whatever the old norms were. So for that group, and then if they do it, it will flow down through that being modelled. Create a norm around giving people credit, addressing them by name, thanking them, whatever. Pick a handful of specific behavioural norms, and that group starts to do it and watch it flow down.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Darren?
I'd probably talk about a bit of zero tolerance, actually. So I think by the time we're getting involved with culture reviews and asking and exploring what are often really toxic, really significant issues, I tend to find that it all starts with the same sort of thing a lot of times. Lots of low-level stuff like, oh, they don't say good morning. It started off because I come in, I say good morning. They don't say good morning to me, and they ignore me for an hour. I constantly feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And those are the sorts of behaviours that seem to kind of be the starting point for pretty much some of the bigger issues. So I would kind of suggest that businesses need to be aware of where these things start and adopt maybe some zero tolerance around some of those sort of low-level behaviours which can manifest and are the starting point for much bigger problems.
Yeah, no, good call, and start to call it out. So
yeah.
And Mark?
Okay, I'll be as brief as possible. I think, both what Katie and Ian have alluded to, it's about leadership. And if there's been a review and there has been issues, it's about leadership publicly standing up and, whether it's, a mea culpa in some way that we could have done things better, publicly accepting there were problems and then showing that they're the ones who are going to be modelling the behaviours and the culture going to the future, so that it's not then just seen as something that's happening on the ground, or, the old story of the consultants have come, okay, the consultants have gone, let's go back to normal. It's about leadership saying, yes, we were wrong. Yes, this could have been better. And this is what the future is going to look like.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Well, we could keep having this conversation for another hour or two, particularly once we start to get into the positive ways of transforming culture. But unfortunately, our hour is up. Thank you very much to our really experienced panelists. I love being able to host these webinars when I get to talk to the experienced team within Mappian. So thank you to you. Thank you to all the participants across Australia. If you have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to contact myself or any of the participants today. There will be an email sent from our office that will give you some contact details. But until we speak next time, thank you very much, everyone, and we will sign off. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.